Okay, so just bearing in mind how we talked about, the thousands of years ago Latin roots of some English words, let me just make a quick sort of geographical lecture about where English comes from. And, let me start here with the Roman Empire. So this is 117 AD. So approximately 1900 years ago, approximately 2000 years ago. But the Roman Empire has been around for a while, at least I don't know 500 years by this point. It was a long empire. I think it actually lasted over 700 years. I forget exactly. But here is the Roman Empire at one of its periods of maximum land area. Now we have Rome here in what would nowadays be called Italy, and that was the center of the Roman Empire. So Latin was the local language that people in that area spoke. It just became a big deal because that little city state of Rome eventually got so powerful that it had this empire. So people all over this empire would have spoken Latin to some extent, or at least if you were someone who wanted to in any way do business or do politics, or maybe you're a merchant that's selling products around the Mediterranean, you would know your local language, which might be, you know, something, that what is this modern day Egypt? Here's modern day Turkey. Whatever the language was in that area, you would learn Latin in order to be able to communicate with anyone else in this area. So if you were born on Cyprus, I don't know if it was called Cyprus then, but you could learn Latin and be able to travel to France or to Spain, which were not yet called France or Spain, but you could talk Latin to people there. So it was, in much the same way English is used around the world as a language of business today. And, that's due to the British Empire and later the American, I guess you would call it empire or hegemony, uh, which has, had sort of two successive waves of English around the world. But we're sticking back to 2,000 years ago, long before England has become a thing, let alone America. Okay, so we have Latin spoken widely. And just as before I go into English itself, it's interesting to note what are the so called Romance languages? They're Portuguese, Spain or Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, and a few smaller other languages are called the Romance languages, and I have a graphic for that. So, if you've ever taken Spanish, which probably a lot of us have, and then you've heard Portuguese, you'll notice they're quite similar, right? Well, these languages are descendants of Latin. Okay, now they're different from each other because they were descendants of Latin in different parts of Europe. But notice in the word Romance languages, oh, there's Rome, right? Roma, Romance. It all comes from Rome. Okay. Now, English, we go back to this graphic. Notice that English, this is what would be modern day England, more or less, right? At that time called Britannia, where we get our modern word Britain from. It's famously, Rome conquered most of what's now England, but it never conquered Scotland, Caledonia. And this is where Hadrian's Wall, I believe it is, was. And Rome never extended its power beyond that point. But this was a Roman colony around this time. And there's a little town, it's very small, called Londinium, which was founded by Romans as a trading outpost and has lasted for 2,000 years and become the town that we would now call London. So, okay, so at this time we have the native Britons, as they were called, that were in this area. The Romans arrive, they leave some words with the local people, some Latin, and they leave some systems of government. But a few hundred years later, let's take a look at this map. This is where English really starts to come from, or starts to arise. English is what's called a Germanic language. It's a different family than the Romance languages. It's really more to do with the northern parts of Europe. Germany, Germanic languages, right? Scandinavia, be modern day, we have Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and then you have, the Netherlands in here, Belgium. So there are these cultures of people forming. This is, I think, around, I want to say 300 or 400 BC. So we're looking at, a few hundred years later than this map of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire has begun to disintegrate. And these cultures of the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes, you can look this up in the history books. I forget why this all started, but these people decided to migrate to what would later be called England. Okay? Where does the word England come from? It comes from this tribe, the Angles, who spoke Anglish and, sort of founded England, English. Okay? So we have this Germanic language that comes over here, and this is a very big migration of people, hundreds of thousands. And if you can think of the amount of people there were in the world in the year, say, 400, there were nowhere near as many people in the world. So that's a substantial movement of people. And so they settle in here and begin forging their own culture and language. And that would be really what we would call Old English. If you've ever read Beowulf, it's not really possible for us modern English speakers to understand without a lot of training, but it is the ancestor of modern English. So we have this history of these tribes moving in, and that's where we start to see English sort of come into its own as a language. And then, just to quickly add, I don't have a graphic for this, unfortunately, but remember about 1,000 years ago, there was what was called the Norman invasion. So that was the Normans in France who were speaking French of a sort. They conquered England. This is the year 1066, the famous 1066. So then now we have a layer of French being added into English. Okay? So English has this bizarre history of migrations, different people, different colonizations that I believe lead to it being such a rich and strange and hard to spell and hard to pronounce language today. So, English is famously hard to learn for people that aren't born speaking it. And I think this is part of the reason why, is because it's a sort of a mutant language. And there were also invasions of sort of Norse Viking people that contributed a lot to the English language. And so there's a number of influences that you have to keep in mind when you consider where a given English word comes from.